Radlands in a nutshell.
Radlands, a rad little card game, a 1v1 dueler that takes place within 20 to 40 minutes, all set in a post-apocalyptic desert world. Yeah, hey, I'm Morton Joe. This is basically Mad Max. Anyways, you spend water to do things instead of, say, mana in these other typical fantasy 1v1 duelers. The huge catch here is that players will both be drawing from the same deck of cards, meaning no deck building required. And then there's asymmetry through these things called camp cards, which also double as players' health. Radlands is just a streamlined, self-contained approach to a 1v1 dueling card game. On a scale from 1 to rad, let's find out how casual or competitive Radlands ends up being with this low accessibility, and if that's even a good fit for you. Let's go. Here's a quick how to play of Radlands. The goal of the game is to destroy each of your opponent's 3 camps. That is, damage them twice. And then make sure your 3 camps don't all die. To damage your opponent's camps and protect yours, you'll have 3 water a turn to do as many actions as you want, and most actions take water. You can play cards from your hand, activate people abilities on the board, draw cards, or use a camp ability if that camp is still alive. Mostly, you'll want to play cards called people to actually protect your camps in this 3-column format. Each camp can have 2 cards in front of it. This protection is crucial, since any card with a card in front of it is protected and cannot be damaged normally, as the card in front of it is now a human meat shield. So say this camp is not protected, then maybe this pyromaniac on the board will burn and damage it by spending a water to use its ability. Or if this vigilante is not protected, it can get attacked by your opponent's soldier, and now the vigilante is damaged, and in being damaged, cannot use its ability anymore to injure an opponent. Important notes regarding people on the board: you can only use their ability once a turn, and you cannot use their ability the turn you play them from your hand. Another type of card you'll draw is called events, which don't get played in the column format, but rather to the side, where there will be a timer in which they actually go off, since your events all progress at the beginning of each of your turns. So when playing this event with a 1 timer, it means that at the start of your next turn, it'll progress to 0, meaning that it will go off and you can use it. You may have seen that cards have a symbol on the top left corner too. This is the junk ability of each card, where if you discard it from your hand on your turn, you get to activate that ability. So here, we can discard this card from our hand and injure one of our opponent's units. Some junking will even let you access the restore ability, which is the only way to undamage cards, including camps. That's basically it. Players will play through this dynamic of first progressing events, then drawing a card to start their turn, and then doing as many actions as they want on a turn, considering that they only have 3 water to spend here. So then at some point, you're going to have to pass your turn. And keep in mind that water is always 3 as a baseline, and you can't save water tokens to use for a later turn. That's it, let's get to the review. Pros time. First off, Radlands has a very good presentation overall. Cards have this vivid, bright, full art on each of them, making them very fun to look at whether they're on the board or in your hand. Or even face down, with these bright pink backs being used for the punk mechanic when you want to spawn one of those units. Great double functionality there of components where, hey, you need this, just grab it from the top of the deck. That was easy. Throughout the game, you'll be looking at a bunch of succinct icons that the player aid helps to translate. A clear distinction between event and people cards, and even the destroyed camps when flipped over look like smoldering wrecks. Cards are all great cardstock too, and maybe these sound effects can help you hear it. There are also a handful of water token pieces that are extremely functional, with one side saying water, the other to indicate what units cannot be activated anymore this turn. And this all fits very well into the no wasted space box, with a bright insert, and everything fits cleanly without need for plastic bags. Radlands is also just very fast to set up. You take out the 3 water for each player, camp cards, 2 miscellaneous cards for each player, and player aids. Radlands is easy to explain to just rope your friends in right away. All you have to explain off the bat is, well, you can do as many actions as you want on a turn to eventually kill all of your opponent's camps. There's no tricky phases or specific sequencing of things you have to do. Turns are flexible. You can attack, then draw, then junk, play a card. You can do this in really any order you want. Like compared to most 1v1 duelers, Radlands has everything trigger cleanly by itself. Once you use an ability, that's it. It's done. The ability will work. It will go through. It's not like other games where sometimes you have this reaction spell, timing, googlog, chain link. Well, how's my phase after that when that counters that? You don't have to worry about that in Radlands. The rulebook is generally pretty good and includes clarifications on the back that is useful while in game. Oh, and then there's a first game recommended set of camps to not overwhelm players with camp synergies off the bat. So now let's get to the gameplay pros of Radlands. And of course, we have to start with the tight action economy. Remember, you can do anything you want as long as you can pay for it. And you only have 3 water, where many abilities cost 2 water to do. It's very intuitive, letting you quickly latch onto how, there's a trade-off between spending water to draw a card, spending water to activate one of your people abilities on the board, or spending water to trigger one of your camp abilities which you always have access to. Something that ties into this well is the water silo mechanic. This is where you deposit 1 water to grab this card, and hey, look, its junk ability is that it gives you a water. So in the future, with this in your hand, you'll have 4 water for any later turn. Doesn't have to be precisely the next turn. The water silo smoothens out water management, where players will never have wasted water. If you have an extra water, well, you can always use it to grab the water silo. If you have an extra water and the water silo already, you can spend that water silo to now have 2 water, and if you still can't play anything, you can draw a card by spending 2 water. We gotta talk about attacking, where Radlands has this cool distinction between normally damaging things and then injuring things to add a lot of color to the people abilities, especially on your board. See, damage means you can damage anything that's unprotected, like damaging a camp. Whereas injure means you can only damage unprotected enemy people. Enemy people only. This is a cool nuance, where injure as an ability is easier to get, but can never do anything to opponents' camps, which are ultimately your win condition. You gotta plan out your board a little more carefully besides just dumping units wherever, where you're balancing how to get and maintain a board through injuring opponents and sometimes damaging them. So more units doesn't necessarily mean you can just smash your opponent's camps in to win. You gotta have the damage. Oh, but this goes hand in hand with this mechanic, the raiders, which leads to even more interesting board states. See, raiders are an event that you can always activate if you have access to this symbol, and once it resolves, your opponent takes 1 point of camp damage, regardless of how they're protected. These raiders moving up and down are always a way to threaten the opponent while being something that's not on the board, meaning that you don't exclusively need to have a bunch of destroy abilities to close out games. Them having some delay, plus the victim choosing which camp to take the hit, lets players really plan around the future turns when those raiders complete their missions and smack camps. Maybe you have to play more aggressively, or else you'll lose the game once those raiders resolve and you get attacked once. As a side note, these raiders are really cool theme-based gameplay, where these raiders in these cars are slowly driving towards your opponent base turn after turn. Once they're done burning down something, they just kind of drive away and sit in the corner until you call on them again to do more rampaging. We also want to praise some of the junk mechanic, where certain elements are quite thinky. This junk capacity of every card means that each card has 2 uses in the hand. Either you can play it on the board or use it for its junk ability. So okay, once you play it, you can't junk it anymore. Careful on that. A great example of this is thinking to discard to trigger the raiders, which starts them down their journey. But hey, you could be in a situation where you are really on the fence about using this holdout card on the board, so maybe I'll just wait until my next turn to play it on the board. But if you really don't play that holdout next turn, and then decide to junk it to trigger raiders, your raiders are now behind on their progress. In general, junking being an action that you can do, despite how much remaining water you have, tends to really open up turns, especially if you have multiple cards in hand. Let's talk about the 2-card combo potential now. After all, this game is all supposed to be about identifying card synergies. So Radlands synergies shine the most in the context of camps, which is the asymmetry in this game. Since you start the game with these camps that have abilities, gameplay strategies can really start opening up in your head right off the bat. Cool synergies can come with prioritizing raiders. Maybe you have this garage to activate raiders for cheap, then use this watchtower that lets you damage for cheap once those raiders' offense resolve. Or use this scavenger camp when your raiders resolve. You can refresh any card. If you like to play a bunch of units, you can have an arcade that spawns you a punk out of nowhere if you have 0 or 1 person. Then you just play one more person, and now you can activate Nest of Spies to do a damage for cheap. Like, whoa, okay, look at this one, Parachute Base, that lets you play a person and use their ability right away, just with the consequence of damaging them. But hey, that damage is not a big deal if you can mulch it for 0 cost to draw a card right away. Or maybe you just inject them with adrenaline to use their ability again, even if they're damaged. When you draw the right cards too, some fun stuff can happen in games. Like, you can play punks with the arcade, and then use this rescue team to bounce, or return it to your hand. It's kind of like drawing a card in a cool new way. Or just use those punks as fuel for your catapult to damage anything. Yeah, let's just fling those punks over to my opponent's camps. This gets into how Radlands' replayability is pretty good. Every game, you'll be drawing 6 camp cards from a deck of 34 unique camps, then looking at these 6 and picking 3 to use. The amount of cards you open the game with are determined through camps, so you can choose to have a bunch of strong abilities but less cards in hand. Or you could swing wildly in the other direction and have 7 cards at the beginning with this obelisk that freaking destroys itself. But hey, you have 7 cards where junking to discard cards for an effect is a thing. So yeah, injure, more water, all on my first turn. What most caught our eye was the Juggernaut, this insane camp that you can spend water to slowly move it forward. That's right, moving a camp. Now it's vulnerable and protecting people behind it if you want to play around with that. If you're somehow able to get this to the front, then move it again, you straight up destroy an opponent's camp. Talk about putting pressure on your opponent to do something about this giant mass headed their way. The final pro to wrap this all up is that Radlands runs very true to time at about 20 to 40 minutes. The action just starts right away, with everyone starting with 3 water, play cards right away, play more cards, but then turns can never get too time consuming later on due to how being restricted to 3 water is such a key thing, and then the Raider mechanic helps do more damage to close out games. Time for the cons of Radlands though. So these camps, we were praising them a lot, but some of them are just not very well balanced. Nothing here is outright broken, but certain combinations of camps are just noticeably stronger. An example of an okay camp is Victory Totem. Spend 2 water, which is the majority of your water, to activate raiders or injure. Always pretty useful, but not crazy in power. Compare that to this card, Atomic Garden, where you can refresh a damaged person and they become ready. This actually really messes with the refresh mechanic, where the game is designed around units not being able to do stuff immediately after refreshing. Any card with an ability with text on it is quite concerning here, like specifically this mutant that does a damage and refreshes something else at the cost of 0 water. Yeah, being able to do all that twice in a turn by only spending 2 water for the camp is crazy. How about this synergy? Remember that card called Parachute Base where you can play a person and use their ability right away, paying for both and then damaging them? This goes directly hand in hand with Blood Bank that lets you destroy one of your people and get 1 water back. This combination is insanely good to just push 1 cost units from your hand, letting them hit hard and fast, then siphoning their bodies for blood and juices and water back to keep going on your turn. Blood Bank in general is just a ridiculously good card to get extra water every turn, provided you have cheap units that are already damaged, or punks that are super easy to get. Picking camps also can get a little weird because you have no idea what your opponent is going to pick, and you have no idea what cards you're going to draw. This really makes the game feel very casual, maybe more casual than the competitive card game as listed on the back of the box suggests. Like say you want to pick Juggernaut, right? This really dynamic camp that is high risk, high reward. Well, do you really want to select it when your opponent might have camps that allow him to easily smack your camps, like a railgun? Or how you don't know if you'll open with cards that can protect it early? The camps being unbalanced and being assigned through this draw 6, pick 3 method couldn't be fixed with a draft either, because to implement a draft, these would have to be closer in power level. And then to take advantage of that draft, well, you'd have to draft your opening hand to get an idea of what you start with, but then the problem is camps determine the size of your opening hand, so you couldn't draft these at the same time that you're drafting those. So yeah, I guess just balance the camp strengths. The next con has to do with events, which besides the raiders, which we like, the actual event cards that you're drawing from the deck aren't that well handled. See, due to how protecting your camps is one of the key elements of the game, starting a hand with a bunch of events is generally not good. Your opponent is building board advantage with all their people, while you can just hinder them, but the events don't really give you any meaningful lasting advantage. Oh, but then drawing 0 timed events at the right time is good. These 0 timed events that interact with the board is wacky in a game that has an event clock built in. Drawing these immediate effect cards ends up being extreme randomness. We're top decking a strafe to do a bunch of damage, or a truce to return everything on the board to a player's hand is just so good, and your opponent can't do anything about it. With most events, you can see them slowly moving up, so there's interaction in both players knowing that it's coming. With the strafe, it's just like, oh hey look, I just neutralized your board off my top deck. Actually, let's talk about this guy that interacts with events, the Doomsayer, which is just not a healthy card. It synergizes way too hard with itself when played, where it pushes every single one of your opponent's events back and has a really good damage ability if your opponent has an event, which they will have for longer since you just pushed events back. The Doomsayer is a weird tech card, or a counter card you would see in a deck building card game, that doesn't work well when both players are randomly drawing from the same deck in Radlands. This hard counters events, hurting Raider strategies too brutally. Currently, there's no way to delete events, and only this Doomsayer to push them back, so we would have liked it if the game just kept it consistent and removed the Doomsayer from the game altogether. Then at least give a mulligan if your opening hand has too many events, and then just make the 0 timed events not 0 timed, or more expensive if they're going to be so swingy. So now that we're done with the event cons, let's move on to the next category of card that is cons, the people. So value here is just not consistent. We're playing a cheaper value card, less water is just always better. Why? Well, every single card, no matter how much water you pay for it, is always 2 health. Combine that with how you don't start with any protection at the beginning of the game, so it's very crucial for you to be playing units to protect your lives. This gets us precisely now to the expensive people, which are not healthy to the game. These costing 3, or 1 being even 4 water to play, means that in most cases it's your entire turn, or you also had to set up the water silo for it before taking your turn. Radlands is a game where you want to protect your camps and expand your options to trigger more things on the board, and expensive units don't set you up well. Remember, they're only 2 health too, so it's not like they have additional protection against getting immediately injured. And when they're turned sideways, their strong passive ability gets negated, which is the prime reason why you really want to play most of these units. So you're supposed to put them behind another person you played on a previous turn to make sure they don't drop in unprotected, but that's asking for quite a bit of setup for an ability that's typically not worth it. It's why lots of other card games where you pay for units have stats, namely different health on units. So then when you're spending resources for big drops, your investment isn't so vulnerable. There's one of these expensive people out of 6 that protects itself, Argo Yeski. He is the one who is viable to play by himself and is also good with others. The others are only good when played with other cards. It's also hard to plan around these units. You're not quite sure what else you'll be drawing with this share deck having an unfocused assortment of cards, and there's just not many drawing possibilities in Radlands. Oh yeah, the lack of drawing cards. Let's actually talk about that with the shadowy side of the junking mechanic. See, the junking mechanic ends up hurting how this game handles randomness because it has to restrict the amount of cards you draw. If it didn't, well then players could load up on a lot of cards to later junk and discard them all at once. With access to less cards, what the heck do you do if you open with a bunch of pricey units and events and your opponent just has a bunch of 1-cost people? There's no mulligan in this game, and getting behind really sucks due to how there's little big swings you can do mid to late game to come back. Also, some junk effects are just too good. Namely, the water and injured junk are really good. These are the proactive junks, where you can have huge tempo plays by suddenly dropping +2 water or 3 injuries to make a big push. In Radlands, things on your board are better than when they're in your hand, and when stuff in the hand can directly affect the board, that's really good. So the junking mechanic does let you do the multi-card usage we keep talking about, but also has that dirty side of hurting the RNG. That's it for the gameplay cons. Now let's get into some quality of life stuff with the iconography. So the actual symbols in this game, they look great. But then this game is also doing that thing where a lot of cards will have a bunch of text on them, and in this case of Immortan Joe, why is destroyed listed twice if there's already a symbol for it? What? Radlands wants to go hard on the full art, but that can hurt visual cohesion. Now text is relegated to the very bottom of cards, which makes it hard to read. Or how junk abilities work well to be in the top left corner when in your hand, but while on the board, ends up distracting from people's names. This hurts the big units that you pay a lot of water for, which seem like they should have an air of importance, but often you don't really read their non-English names because they're sideways. Currently, Radlands is trying to be simple with depicting abilities through symbols, but doesn't succeed on it. And seeing how this is a more casual game, it should go harder on introducing a couple more symbols. How about introducing symbols that mean, oh, you can damage something anywhere with this specific damage icon, or making camps their own symbol. These iconography concerns just lead up into how this game's weird ruling buts aren't explained too well. Like how about for camps? When they take damage, turn sideways, they can actually still use their abilities. Well, that's directly opposite to people where when they take damage, they can't use their ability. But you would figure that these work in the same way because both their abilities have black outlines for them. Well, that's kind of confusing. Now it is time for a recommender score on Radlands, where we try to critically evaluate the pros and cons of the game and determine whether or not this is even a good idea in the first place. So, this Radlands is going to be a 7 out of 10. It is good. But wait a second, Shelfside. Huh? You didn't praise the game that much, and you just talked about a bunch of bad things in the cons. You said they weren't healthy. Okay, yeah, they're not the healthiest things, but judging on what Radlands is, they don't hurt the box too much. And here's the next thing. Radlands has a bunch of elements that are just pretty standard for a dueling card game. Like some card synergies to get advantage, some asymmetry, some tempo management, and yeah, it does them pretty well. It's hard to talk about these in depth in the pros because they're not hugely notable things, combined with how the systems and cards are simple anyways to make this game accessible. And the Mad Max post-apocalyptic theme integrated with the gameplay is just kind of here. I mean, raiders are cool, and that makes sense, but other than that, spending water to activate abilities feels a little generic. I mean, it totally works if you just say that, yeah, water is like mana. It's like money. Because does it make sense to literally use water to fuel a radiator to injure everyone or fuel this reactor to blow up everything? Yeah, so it's just kind of like currency. Water is currency here. Radlands also ends up having a lot of things that are good, except for when they're sometimes not. Like their simplicity of each person card you can play. Nice. But them not having stats can really mess with how lower cost people are just better. Or how the camp selection is streamlined for the 3 asymmetric abilities it gives. But then that has some imbalance, and again, you can't account for your opponent when picking them. Or then there's a junking mechanic that makes cards multi-use in the hand, but then this forces the game to restrict card draw. Oh yeah, we have to talk about the unique junking, right? This is something that's stretching the game in some different directions. Like the fact that you can discard cards from your hand without spending mana to trigger pretty useful abilities starts abstracting the possibilities when you think of counterplay of your opponent's hand in a dueling card game. Like sometimes seeing your opponent do the act of water siloing to save up for a future turn might not be that impactful because, well, they might have other cards in their hand already that give them extra water. Or then how this game only has 2 types of cards to draw, but there's no response for 0 timed events. It's like these 0 timed events should feel more zany then, but then this game is fundamentally an intricate tug of war that gets disrupted from these card drops. Radlands is just trying really hard to be casual to bring this tight card play to your kitchen table, but to keep decision making fairly high and replay value good so you'll keep playing, it adds all sorts of abilities of varied strengths and it makes cards multi-use in a simple system. So the combos and strategies ultimately aren't that nuanced for this genre. When we look at the singular deck of 46 cards here, we're just thinking, yeah, either make this deck a whole lot bigger to make this game more casual, so then you can laugh about dumb draws, or balance the game. Because there's currently some variety in the deck, but then there's an exact 2 of every single card, except for the expensive people in a card dueler. Yeah, exactly 2 of all the events as well. This deck is right now the worst of many worlds. Too many types of cards to reasonably predict what you'll be drawing, and not big enough to laugh it off. That criticism is just again showcasing this weird gray area that Radlands is straddling. But it's still a good game. It's still a good game for what it is. It is currently a casual leaning, yet not zany dueling card game with a very functional mana water system. Radlands is super easy to get into, is entirely self-contained, and has strategy with picking camps, meeting tactics with random card draw. It is the epitome of a dinner table game or a coffee shop game, where you could get semi-competitive with it if you're willing to excuse how it doesn't handle randomness, as well as other 1v1 duelers. At the end of the day, we have to give Radlands a bit of a pass by positioning itself as competitive, because for a possibly 20-minute game, it still overall demands serious play with tempo management and is highly confrontational. Radlands being very insistent on providing only 3 water keeps the game short and turns simple, but prevents popping off turns where all the resources line up for a comeback that can be hype in other duelers. So while not doing anything specifically glowing, Radlands still fits this unique niche of grab and go with anyone for a 1v1 tug of war card duel. Good for couples or even as a gateway game. Just grab camps, draw from a single deck, and go. You don't have to explain strategies that you're supposed to do with your pre-built decks. No, just start playing in minutes.
Man, for how often I say that, personally, I'm not the biggest fan of 2-player games. We sure seem to end up covering them pretty often. My personal score for Radlands is going to be a 5 out of 10 in average time. So first of all, here's my obligatory, I'd rather be playing a TCG like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic disclaimer. But it's finally time to elaborate on that preference. As always, I'm a fan of tons of options, player interaction plus player expression, and a healthy amount of randomness. You know what ends up doing that really well? Card games that allow their players to build a deck tailored to their playstyle from a massive pool of cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! You got all these archetypes to play around with, tons of engines to splash into your decks, and an absurd amount of playlines to take because of the existence of your extra deck. That, and there's constant interaction as well as mind games going on because of trap cards, or I guess nowadays hand traps. And in Magic's case, the simple act of floating mana leads to so much decision making to play around, especially if the board already has a bunch of creatures with abilities that cost mana. So not only are you thinking about if your opponents will respond by using their mana on abilities, but also if they're holding certain instants in their hand. As you may have noticed, Radlands has no deck building, nothing going on for the non-turn player, and nowhere near as many options you can do in a turn compared to TCGs. Couple all that with how players draw from the same deck that's mostly comprised of duplicates, and Radlands ends up feeling like it lacks soul to me. Both players are doing very similar plays and strategies thanks to limited symbol variety, and so replayability instead comes from all the camps in the game. But then the camps don't offer nearly enough gameplay diversity to me because it's usually the people that you play who end up eventually swinging the board state in your favor to eventually overwhelm your opponent because people will almost always have more mana efficient abilities than camps. To steal more terms from Magic, Radlands doesn't appeal to the Timmy side of me, the Johnny side, or the Spike side. For those who don't know, these are terms for types of players. Timmy being the person who loves slamming down big flashy monsters. Johnny loves winning in really weird ways, and Spike is a tryhard who just wants to win. First of all, the big costed people in Radlands suck. You spend your whole turn slamming them down, and then your opponent simply injures them to turn them off. Boom, you're at a tempo deficit, and it feels bad to be Timmy since your big dude didn't even do anything. As a result, they only really work if you have a sick combo like Zito Khan into Uprising. These combos are legitimately cool, but again, you can't deck build, so there goes any hope of me going full Johnny building a meme strategy. But then if I play the game like Spike and play to win, it's pretty linear to me because after the initial onslaught of cards from each player's starting hands, Radlands turns into a top deck game state as early as turn 2 or 3. So if I'm being Spike, all that matters is to find ways to resolve my people's abilities as often as possible, and it almost doesn't even matter what abilities are being used. They're all pretty mana efficient and will usually win you the game if uncontested for like 2 turns. I also really dislike junking as a mechanic because it means that card draw effects become really strong in Radlands, which also means there's a distinct lack of effects that draw you a ton of cards. I love drawing cards. It's a huge part about why other card games present such variable game states and option selection. Meanwhile, in Radlands, there's a bit of it feeling like the game plays itself because if I don't have board, build board, ASAP. If I have a board, get value out of my people's abilities and just junk whatever I drew for tempo. So the whole time, it feels like I'm top decking and just playing whatever I happen to draw, and occasionally, there's a terrible draw with a super expensive card, or a completely asinine luck sack of a top deck like Strafe. In a way, Radlands to me is comparable to a mediocre draft set from another card game. Already in draft formats, building and maintaining board advantage is the default strategy since using other strategies is going to be more unreliable. It's just that in Radlands, you still fight for board but with less interesting cards and a really inconsistent deck you didn't get to build. And then to top it all off, the theme and art doesn't really do anything for me personally. Not that the art is bad, the quality of it is pretty goddamn spectacular. I'm just not a fan of the aesthetic style. Which really annoys me because I love it when card games have full art on them and very little space is taken up by icons and text. But then, I really hate how the cards have their names on the side because I end up never reading them and I don't know anything by name, which causes them all to blend together without much distinctive personality. Like, the only things I thematically enjoy are some of the camps like Blood Bank and Garage, which, speaking of, I love the theme of raid as a mechanic. I really wish Radlands went harder on going full Mad Max by having vehicle equip cards and further expanding the lane-based gameplay to better thematically visualize driving vehicles around the board to blow up camps. Because at the moment, the only thing lanes do is determine what you want to be protecting. That's it. So that's all for my personal takes. I know this all seems like I'm bashing the game super hard, but I still have an okay time with it, hence 5 out of 10. It's definitely a pretty chill game that you can play with basically anyone where you don't have to go full brain power. You can just relax while just playing cards.
My personal score for Radlands is going to be a 7 out of 10. Yeah, I have a good time with it. Yeah, a pretty cool card game. I can just pick up and go. There's pretty good asymmetries, varied cards, and that's what I thought of Radlands after my first couple plays. Yeah, after playing this game a lot in person and over TTS, I'm gonna go ahead and lower that score to a 4 out of 10, below average. Okay, so as I said, this game makes a good first impression, and I thought the depth would just really start opening up with the camps and memorizing the deck. And not really. More so, I continued to get hung up on some of the general systems, which, as satisfying as they were to jump into initially, were just as frustrating to keep encountering. So the camps, while asymmetric, these are just melded together in a way where I felt like players had no real personalities going on in the game, which I really want in card duelers. Plus, due to how constrained the mana system is, you couldn't combo them very hard when they are cool. And then there's also when the inexpensive ones do get abused, advantages felt unfair, which got compounded onto this game's unhealthy randomness through events and the junking system to make it feel like outcomes between my competent buddies and I sometimes decided themselves. In fact, this game hits this weird ground where it feels so simple in people design. Haha, they only have 2 health, all of them. But then because of how tempo is so important, I can't just turn off my brain and still have to worry about multi-use cards in hand. Like, this gets really aggravated in late game, where the game can sometimes feel like it went in circles with practically no progression, and combos still can't happen because of water restrictions, and units are all still getting neutered easily. Radlands never had hype card drops or popping off combos. Once the tug-of-war rope starts going one way in this game, the momentum just keeps going and going because someone with a better board starts activating all their abilities. And the defensive person just has a noose just slowly strangled around them. You can't play defensively in this game. And this is not a bad thing. It could be very intentional too, where, yeah, if some person gets ahead, you can just scoop and go for the next game. But me, being the optimistic person I am and wanting more cool comeback stories, misses that in this game. Like, I remember times in other card duelers where, oh, you set me up for my Dark Arm Dragon actually. Or hey, my deck is finally panning out in Magic and I can drop this 7/7 on you and you can't do anything about it. Cool comeback story. Then in Radlands, I don't really know what I'll draw with the deck with not that many duplicates of cards, making it hard to plan ahead. But then at the same time, I'm sharing a deck with my opponent with fairly shallow asymmetry, and that makes openings feel incredibly generic. Or how there's no reaction possibilities for a game that is so confrontational, making me equate Radlands a lot to optimizing your tableau the best you can on your turn, and then just sitting back and crossing your fingers that your opponent doesn't have a way to injure your board multiple times. I ultimately don't ever see this dropping below a 4 out of 10. Yeah, because I would gladly introduce it to newcomers or even an SO in the future when I want to introduce them to what I mean when I say dueling card game tension. It being such an easy game to teach is just a good tool to show people what I'm into, what my hobby is kind of like. But wait, we have more. If you want to know more about Radlands, we have a Shelfside podcast where we just talked about Radlands in a full episode.
Also, if you want to know more about Shelfside, not just Radlands, that podcast happens to have other episodes. You know, it is the Shelfside podcast after all.
Exactly. Yeah, we talk about a rating system, more in depth about games, what's going on with our game patterns, our playing of games in our normal life. So here's a little sneak peek of that Radlands podcast. Go. Okay, Radlands was basically everything I thought.
Do a streamlined like card game experience, I guess. Take out everything about the card games that make them like kind of annoying to just hop into, right? So like,
we'll stop it here. Yeah, so go check that out if you want to take a look.
I thought that was like literally it. Like we're just done after.
I was gonna put it. And thank you to our patrons for making videos like this possible. We got Manuel G, Brian C, Clifford H, Bora, Jeremy M, Charlie P, Quinton S, Album Y, Vams K, Matt G, Spear71, Ryan J, Brad G, Tiamo, Mark A, James M, Evan B, Charles P Jr., Josh J, Bass Rado, Sophie, Cole Nelson, Hudson T, Pearson B, Omar F, MY, Ethan P, Bradley J, John C, Jerk S, SS Co, Alex L, Rob R, Sensei 2, Dave F, Josh R, Pat, Cyril C, Il Wayne, Kyle M, Emir H, Rala Spin, Keanu S, Owl Bucks, John R, John P, Nicholas R, Andre, Kevin G, Alex G, Tim W, Jordan F, Ben A, Jeff B, Michael Z, Jeremy G, Vivian J, 10, Gino D, and Andre B. We also got our Mad Lads cardboard. We got ZL, Jeff L, The Doctor, and Peter Z, and that guy right there. We also got our Mad Lady cardboard. We got Amy. That was Radlands. Remember to like, comment, subscribe. Love to see what you think of this game or games like it. Maybe we can review stuff like that in the future. Yeah. See you guys later. Bye-bye. And yeah, we don't have a map for this.